Chapter 29, Nixon and Ailes. Television and I grew up together. Roger Ailes. The assassinations of Martin Luther King Jr. and Robert Kennedy shattered whatever unity remained in America. Riots spread throughout major cities, powered by the despair and rage at the failures of civil rights and in Vietnam. The Democratic Party was in shambles. Fearing a rout by Robert Kennedy, Johnson withdrew from the election only for Kennedy to be murdered. At the Democratic Convention in Chicago, anti-war candidate Eugene McCarthy lost the nomination to Johnson's VP, Hubert Humphrey. Outside the convention, police beat protesters with billy clubs. The crowd chanted, "The whole world's watching," which it was, as the beatings were televised. On ABC's convention coverage, William Buckley and Gore Vidal tore at each other's throats, arguing whether the left or the right was responsible for the decline of America. Conflicts loomed for the Republicans as well. Richard Nixon had been out of office for 8 years now, following his agonizing loss to Kennedy in 1960 and a humiliating defeat in the 1962 California gubernatorial race. In the interim, he relentlessly dissected his every misstep, determined to never lose an election again. Nixon knew that he had made two principal mistakes. First, he had underestimated television. He had watched Kennedy's 1956 convention speech and thought it revealed his opponent to be a callow, inexperienced, rich kid. Nixon assumed that television would help him in the debates and show Kennedy to be a lightweight. But television had loved Kennedy, and it had helped him steal the election. Now Nixon saw he needed to plan his own way to conquer television. Secondly, Nixon had played it clean. He had campaigned by the rules, and it had cost him everything. Underneath the facade, Kennedy had proven to be a master of dirty politics. Suspect voting records from Chicago, from dead voters in some cases, and from Johnson's Texas tipped the scales, giving Kennedy a lead of fewer than 100,000 votes from a total cast of 60 million. Kennedy won fewer states, but took the Electoral College in the tightest election of the century. Being honest had cost Nixon the presidency. Next time, he would learn from Kennedy and do whatever it took to win. Thus, with the election of 1960, did Watergate begin. Early life. Richard Milhouse Nixon was born in California in 1913 to hard-working Quaker parents who farmed and then ran a general store. His childhood in the town of Whittier was punishing. One older brother died when Richard was 12, and a second one 10 years later. Dick Nixon was a serious student and an indefatigable worker, rising at 4 a.m., driving the long road to Los Angeles to buy vegetables for the family store, then returning home and heading off to school. His father had been born unlucky, never caught a break. He brooded and had violent moods. His mother Hannah was the opposite, withholding and distant. Caught between fire and ice, Nixon yearned for their approval, excelling at school in a very lonely childhood. Decades later, Henry Kissinger would ask, "Can you imagine what this man would have been like if somebody had loved him?" Nixon performed in the school play, wrote excellent papers, became high school class president, and was then accepted to Harvard. Unfortunately, he could not afford to attend, beginning a lifelong bitterness towards the Ivy League in general and, quote, Harvard bastards, end quote, in particular. Nixon attended Whittier College in 1930 and experienced another of the rejections that seemed to plague him when campus club the Franklins declined to accept him. Nixon responded by creating another group called the Orthogonians, a bigger club for the, quote, have-nots, close quote. When Nixon ran for class president, his victory seemed assured until the Franklins submitted a candidate at the 11th hour to run against him. Nixon pounced, proposing that the campus allow dances, and submitted a plan to the administration. He won the election. In 1934, Nixon won a scholarship to Duke Law School, after which he returned to Whittier, took a job at a small law firm, and met a beautiful USC girl named Pat Ryan. Pat had grown up in poverty and, like Nixon, worked nonstop to improve her future prospects. Nixon asked Pat out for 2 years before she said yes. They were married in 1940. When war broke out, Nixon joined the Navy. He was already an anti-Roosevelt Republican. In 1945, with the war end at hand, he was asked if he wanted to run for Congress. Nixon was selected to take on five-term Democrat Jerry Voorhees in the 1946 race. Never a natural public speaker, he worked tirelessly to improve his style and hired campaign manager Murray Chotiner, who began schooling Nixon in the art of negative campaigning. Nixon implied that Voorhees was a socialist during the campaign, while Nixon positioned himself as a man of the people. Nixon crushed Voorhees and headed to Washington, where he met another new congressman, also fresh from the Navy, on the Labor and Education Committee. The two colleagues traveled to Pennsylvania, where they discussed labor policy in a mock debate. Nixon said that his new friend, Jack Kennedy, and he were like a pair of unmatched bookends. In 1948, the Red Scare was in full effect, and the viciousness of the House Un-American Activities Committee was making Republicans look bad. The leadership thought a younger voice might help their party's image, so Nixon was recruited. He soon began building a case against a Democrat named Alger Hiss, a suspected communist. Hiss had gone to Harvard Law, clerked at the Supreme Court, and had been involved in the creation of the United Nations. He was handsome, from a good family, and in almost every way the opposite of Richard Nixon. When Nixon questioned him, Hiss pushed back, quote, "I am familiar with the law. I attended Harvard Law School. I believe yours was Whittier?" End quote. The class mockery was not a smart move by Hiss. Over a period of months, Nixon bore down on him, found evidence against him, and had him indicted for perjury. When Hiss was convicted, Nixon became both a hero and a villain. The right saw him as a natural foe of communism. The left saw him as a political opportunist, exploiting fear of communism for his own ends. Both sides were correct. The left began to drop the Nixons from the guest list of Georgetown's inner circle, even as his stock was rising and he prepared for a Senate run. When he announced his intentions, one Democrat came to commend him. "Dick, I know you're in for a pretty rough campaign, and my father wanted to help out." Then Jack Kennedy handed Nixon a check for $1,000, for which Nixon was grateful. But the Kennedys underestimated Nixon. His opponent, actress Helen Gahagan Douglas, was an easy target for Nixon's anti-red techniques. Nixon beat her handily and took his Senate seat in 1950. Rumors began that the young anti-communist senator was being considered as the running mate for war hero General Eisenhower. Nixon was formally selected at the 1956 Republican Convention. The boy from Whittier had gone from nowhere to the top in one remarkable decade. Trouble was coming, but a new device would help. The Checker Speech. Soon after Eisenhower chose him as his 1952 running mate, Nixon was accused of accepting bribes. A headline appeared in the New York Post. "Secret rich men's trust fund keeps Nixon in style far beyond his salary." Republicans smelled a scandal, and they urged Ike to dump Nixon from the ticket. The drumbeat of Nixon's enemies grew louder. Already on the campaign trail, the Eisenhower camp stopped communicating with Nixon. A lifelong insomniac, Nixon paced the floor and suspected the worst. Then finally, Eisenhower called Nixon with a piece of advice. Nixon should take his story to the people. He should go on television. Nixon pushed for Eisenhower's support, but that's the only option that Ike gave him. Go on TV, and then we'll decide. The pressure was tremendous. Nixon worked on the speech for days, rewriting it over and over. The Republican campaign bought Nixon a primetime slot from NBC, immediately following Texaco Star Theater starring Milton Berle. The slot was a massive live window with no safety net. Nixon figured he was finished, but decided that he would not go down without a fight. He appeared on NBC on September 23, 1952, at 9:30 p.m. Eastern Time. He sat behind a cheap cardboard desk on a flimsy talk show set with his wife Pat beside him. Nixon confronted the accusation that he had taken bribes as 60 million Americans watched. Nixon disclosed the couple's rent, a loan from the parents, and how much they paid for life insurance. "That's what we have, and that's what we owe. It isn't very much," he said. Pat did not have a mink coat, he said, but a respectable Republican cloth coat. Without saying it explicitly, Nixon positioned himself as a victim. He wasn't done. In a final flourish, he disclosed one gift that he had received for his 2 young daughters, a cocker spaniel named Checkers. The girls, he said, loved the dog, and Nixon was drawing the line. "I want to say right now that regardless of what they say, we're going to keep it." Nixon encouraged voters to contact the Republican National Committee and then was cut off. He had run out of television time. After the speech, Nixon thought that he was doomed. And indeed, most journalists who watched thought the same thing. They were disgusted. Nixon was vile, they thought, an obvious fraud. But in the studio, a few cameramen were weeping. They knew a working man when they saw one. In Eisenhower's suite, his advisors were skeptical, but his wife, Mamie, was not. She was crying. NBC was flooded with calls supporting Nixon. So was the Republican National Committee by telegrams saying the same thing. Nixon received over 4 million letters and telegrams. Checkers was flooded with collars, dog food, and toys. When Eisenhower appeared for a stump speech that night, the crowd chanted Nixon's name. Television, everyone said, had saved Nixon's career. Nixon had used television to go over the heads of the chattering class, the ones who never liked him anyway. If it hadn't been for that speech, he often said, he never would have been around to run for president. In January, at age 39, Richard Nixon became the 37th Vice President of the United States. The kitchen debate. The most important challenge of Nixon's vice presidency would be an international one around the Cold War. It took place on television. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was on a roll. He had pushed to modernize Russia, dismantle Stalinism, and to advance the space program. In 1956, he famously told a group of Western ambassadors that, "We will bury you." Khrushchev was the face of the Cold War and a bogeyman of 1950s America. Eisenhower needed to meet with him, but decided to send his subordinate first. So Nixon traveled to Moscow in 1959, where he and Khrushchev went to an RCA-built studio for a broadcast on Russian television. Nixon proudly demonstrated RCA's color television, quote, "This is one of the most advanced developments in communication we have in our country. It is color television. It is one of the best means of communication that has been developed," end quote. Khrushchev was unimpressed. Next, they moved to a set designed to show Russian viewers what an American kitchen looked like, and began a broadcast for both Americans and Soviets. During it, Nixon stood toe-to-toe with Khrushchev, seeming to win his respect. Khrushchev, "I hope I have not insulted you." Nixon, "I have been insulted by experts. Everything we say, on the other hand, is in good humor. Always speak frankly." Khrushchev, "You're a lawyer of capitalism. I'm a lawyer for communism. Let's kiss." Nixon, "All I can say, from the way you talk and the way you dominate the conversation, you would have made a good lawyer yourself. What I mean is, here you can see the type of tape which will transmit this very conversation immediately, and this indicates the possibilities of increasing communication. As this increase in communication will teach us some things, and it will teach you some things too. Because after all, you don't know everything." The kitchen debate was broadcast by all 3 American broadcast networks and was a huge boost to Nixon's presidential aspiration. By standing up to Khrushchev, Nixon had shown that he was ready to lead. Kennedy. By the time Dick Nixon and Jack Kennedy ran against each other, they had known each other for 13 years. Nixon had gone to Kennedy's 1953 wedding and to his hospital bed 1 year later after Kennedy had nearly fatal back surgery. Nixon wept, praying by the unconscious Kennedy, "Oh God, don't let him die." Perhaps this led Nixon to underestimate Kennedy. It probably influenced Nixon's hunch about television, that it would show Kennedy to be the sickly man that he was. As the 1960 campaign commenced, Kennedy focused on TV appearances, blanketing popular shows with his family and his smile. Meanwhile, Nixon foolishly announced that he'd appear in all 50 states, with over 15,000 miles of travel quickly exhausting him. Nixon was exhausted by September 25th, the day of the first debate. He'd wasted his morning speaking to a hostile labor union and arrived at the studio only 20 minutes before the debate. He was still suffering from banging his knee on a car door and had lost 10 pounds due to an illness. Kennedy was well-rested and completely prepared. The first debate was produced by Don Hewitt of CBS News, who would go on to create and oversee 60 Minutes. Hewitt knew Nixon looked bad and worried Nixon would blame him later, and he was right. It was the beginning of a long-running enmity between CBS and Nixon. The speech was the most-watched political event since the Chequers speech, with 80 million viewers. Nixon's advisors had warned him to go easy, to moderate his voice, to avoid his frequently belligerent tone. The caution left him looking weak and ill at ease. When the debate ended, one audience member yelled up to Nixon, "That's all right. You'll do better next time." The microphones picked her up. They were supposed to. She worked for the Kennedys. Before the debate, many questioned Kennedy's fitness for the presidency. He was young, inexperienced, and simply not ready. But after the debate, that issue was defanged. On the heels of a post-debate surge in the polls, Bobby Kennedy exploited another media gift. Nixon had always polled higher in the black community than Kennedy. The poor man from Whittier had more sympathy for the disenfranchised and had shown far more interest in civil rights than the millionaire's son. Nixon stood up against segregated hotels on behalf of black reporters covering his campaign. So when Martin Luther King Jr. was arrested that October, Nixon wanted to act and asked the White House to intervene on King's behalf. Ike refused. So Bobby Kennedy went into action and got Dr. King released. A great photo op ensued. The African-American vote began to move from Nixon to Kennedy, where it helped to tip the scales and cement Nixon's fate. Nixon came to believe that the press had been in the bag for JFK all along. After all, Kennedy dined and drank with leading reporters. He gave exclusive to the ones he liked and who were good to him. Jack Kennedy played the game. Nixon later summarized what he'd learned for the future, quote, "I vowed that I would never again enter an election at a disadvantage by being vulnerable to them or anyone on the level of political tactics," close quote. Nixon would be on the offensive for the rest of his career. Tricky Dick. Nixon next ran in the 1962 California gubernatorial race, in which he was beaten badly. After staying up all night and drinking too much, he made one of his greatest blunders before the television cameras. Quote, "Good morning, gentlemen. Now that all the members of the press are delighted that I have lost, I'd like to make a statement of my own. Just think how much you're going to be missing. You won't have Nixon to kick around anymore because, gentlemen, this is my last press conference." The statement would have been the end of almost anyone else. Nixon returned to private life to dissect every mistake he had made and to wait for another chance. By the end of 1967, evidence was growing that, provided he could win on television, America might be ready for Nixon in '68. Then, on January 9th, 1968, Richard Nixon met the future of television news. Roger Ailes. Nixon was appearing on the popular Mike Douglas show when he was approached by the show's 27-year-old producer. The producer promptly diagnosed Nixon's problem in the '68 campaign. He needed a media advisor for television. "What's a media advisor?" asked Nixon. "I am," said Roger Ailes. "It's a shame a man has to use gimmicks like this to get elected," Nixon told Ailes. Ailes' response was quick. "Television is not a gimmick, and if you think it is, you'll lose again." Nixon knew that television would make or break his campaign, and Ailes seemed to know what he was talking about, so Nixon hired him. Ailes went to work producing a series of TV segments called Man in the Arena. They showed Nixon as a thoughtful, responsive, measured leader, complete with Hollywood lighting and makeup. Nixon did as he was told by Ailes, even appearing on Laugh-In. At one campaign appearance, he poked fun at himself. "Gentlemen, this is not my last press conference." It worked. Richard Nixon was ready for prime time, and unlike the increasingly erratic LBJ, on television Nixon appeared measured, calm, and statesmanlike. With Roger Ailes' help, in November of 1968, he became the 37th President of the United States. While working for Nixon's White House, Ailes wrote a plan for putting the GOP on TV news. This 15-page memo argued that the White House and the Republican Party needed to create their own production arm for television. This new organization would take on prejudices of network news, providing pro-Republican stories pre-rendered for television news. Ailes' argument was prescient. Quote, "Today, television news is watched by more people more often than people read newspapers, than people listen to radio, than people read or gather any other form of communication. The reason? People are lazy. With television, you just sit, watch, listen. The thinking is done for you." The White House, Ailes said, needed to produce TV that would do the thinking for America. It was one of the smartest documents since the memos of Sarnoff, but Nixon's interest in reaching out was over. Ailes was terminated by the White House in 1971. He returned to the White House for Nixon's ally, George H.W. Bush, who had been Nixon's chairman at the Republican National Committee and his ambassador to the United Nations. Ailes would advise First President Bush on wardrobe, staged briefings to, quote, heighten the drama for the news media, close quote, and choice of activities, quote, do a little more fishing and less golfing, close quote. He did this until the world was ready for his real vision. In 1996, Roger Ailes launched the Fox News Channel. He would run it for the next 20 years.
W from what the hell's the fucking point back into action? You talk a good one, but you won't talk it unless you're standing next to your captain. Make your rent, paying debt to your taxes, the natural boy red zone. If you want